Okay, Unit 5 really begins in 1989 or right about there, and uh, finishes in the current day. And we'll try to cover as much of that as we possibly can. The main first thing we want to talk about is the U.S. and the global economy. There were a lot of major changes in the late 80s and early 90s with regard to how the economy, globally at least, kind of worked and how it became very interconnected. And the terminology used, it was called global integration. And the driving force behind this integration was technology. And two very, very important technological, I guess, advancements. One, of course, and most important, is the internet, the sharing of communication across the world very quickly and very efficiently. And then the other is the moving of money very efficiently and very quickly, much more so than in the past. Money can change hands in a matter of, almost nanoseconds, if you want to use that kind of terminology. But this global integration of all the economies being interconnected, and it allowed many companies, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes, to become more global in scope. You'll see the rise of multinational corporations. Um, Also, during this time, you see the rise of the European Union as China as economic powerhouses. Of course, the European Union was kind of a bonding or an integration of most all of the European countries into one economy with one, well, a majority of them had a common currency, although some kept their own currencies, like Great Britain, but or the United Kingdom, which includes England. Um, but it created a very powerful economic bloc. Also, China becomes maybe, well, for sure, the fastest growing economy in the world, and most importantly, it the communist government embraced capitalism, or the capitalist economic form, which was kind of contradictory to the communist historical communist way of viewing economic power, very centralized. The communist whole idea of communism is everything is centralized in the national government. And the national government controls, most everything about the economy, which is, supply and demand, distribution, all those things. Well, capitalism is a free market of that, where the market determines all those things. So it was really a dramatic shift from traditional communist norms in China. Also, one thing about China is they have very, very cheap labor. They, you know, the labor force that makes the Chinese goods in this new capitalist system is able to make them very, very cheaply, much, much more cheaply than the U.S. or European countries can make things. Therefore, their exports exploded, and in turn, uh, American and European imports exploded. And while it had dramatic effects on our economy, mainly, well, it's twofold. Mainly with all these cheap goods flooding in, competing with American-made goods. Well, American-made goods could not compete in the marketplace. Our labor uh, force, the wages were too high to compete. It costs more to make, so much more to make a television, for instance, in America than it did in China. And so people buying all these new Chinese televisions, and therefore, the television manufacturers in the United States going out of business, laying people off, and it created a real economic crisis. Uh, but the flip side, and this is always the argument of the pro free trade group, is that everything's cheaper. Most everything you buy starting in the 1990s becomes much, much less expensive. And I forgot to mention that the EU, the European Union, with its, it was a very controversial formation at the time, but the United Kingdom, England, voted to leave in 2016. So they are no longer part of it. It was called something called Brexit, Brexit. It was their vote to leave the European Union because they felt like it infringed on their sovereign rights, the rights of a nation to individually determine its own laws and things, and they felt like that the European Union infringed on that. Other economic changes, international organizations and corporations become very pronounced and very controversial. Of course, after World War II, in order to help rebuild many of the decimated nations throughout the world from World War II, but also to, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Probably to stabilize the economy and make it more smoothly transitioning from one nation to another. The World Bank was established. The International Monetary Fund was established. The General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, GATT, was established. And the Group of 7 or 8, depending on which nations are part of it, were formed to help stabilize the economy. But and that seems like a good thing on the surface, but many people were protested against it and were adamantly against it because they basically argued that by centralizing all this economy in a world type or a multinational bodies, that it basically creates this huge global, powerful, uber wealthy banking elite that really controls the economies of every nation on earth, can make or break the economies of every nation on earth. And there's probably some legitimate arguments in support of that. The G8, the Group of 8, is basically all those major countries that are the most powerful economically. But of course, others now these days, of course, they include U.S., Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and Russia. But of course, there are other economies now that are becoming much, much more powerful that are kind of still left on the sidelines, like India and Brazil. The World Trade Organization was one of the most important ones, managed global trade policy, basically trying to end any and all tariffs or taxes on trade. Tariffs are basically taxes on imports. And you can have export tariffs, but it's rarer than import tariffs. And the goal of a tariff is to make foreign goods more expensive so people will buy domestic goods. And when people buy domestic goods or goods made in your own country, then that puts people to work. And so historically, tariffs or trade taxes have been part of the economy throughout history. But in more recent years, the last few decades, starting, really in the 1980s, you've seen a huge decline in the number of tariffs worldwide, which was the goal of the World Bank and the IMF and World Trade Organization. Also, specifically to North America, the North America Free Trade Agreement, passed in 1993, also called NAFTA, basically removed almost all trade barriers between the three major nations of North America, Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And because of all these things, including the technological advancement, you see the proliferation of multinational corporations that can cross borders because of there's less rules, there's less laws that limit the power of corporations during this time period. And so you see companies like, at the time at least, Walmart and Apple become multinational corporations. And of course, when corporations go into, like American corporations, go into other nations, especially nations in more distant parts of the world, it can't help but change the culture of those countries. And there was a huge backlash to the cultural changes, the capitalistic changes that come to these maybe traditionally indigenous or regional economies. And basically, the nickname of it, it's a derisive nickname. It's not a good nickname. They called it McWorld, where basically now, in the past, every country is very different from every other country because of their culture, their economic traditions, things like that. And now basically McDonald's will be in every country, and so that you can't tell the difference between one country and the other. It's kind of an extreme argument, but I think you understand the idea of this this McWorld where, there's a McDonald's and a Pizza Hut on Walmart on every corner. Also, during this time, during the 1990s especially, you see financial deregulation become very important in the U.S. and Great Britain. And basically, and this was the goal of free market capitalist thinkers for a long time, and that was elimination of New Deal era regulations. If you remember, the New Deal basically placed rules on banking especially, but in other parts of the economy, but especially on banking, as far as the riskiness of the things that they could do, because it was wheeling and dealing in high risk banking loans and investments that the banks were making during, that caused the Great Depression, that caused the spiral downward into the Great Depression. And these new rules were put into place to kind of prevent that from happening again. And throughout, from 1940s up through early 1980s, we had no more major economic crises. You had your normal dips, recessions, and problems, but no banking crisis where the banking system threatened to collapse, which, of course, in our current world, if the banking system collapses, the economy collapses. But basically, the regulations of the New Deal were to separate, mom and pop banking, where you put your savings account, separate that from investment firms that take all their money and maybe put that money into high risk investments. That way, if they're separated, you don't lose all of your savings account from the bank if the bank goes under because of bad investments. So all these were put in place, but starting in the 80s, they began to roll those back, eliminate those. And so you start seeing with these eliminations, these banks can be more risky. And the financial industry saw the profits from these risky investments, and they're thinking, oh, this is great. This can never, this is going to always go up. I don't know if you remember when we talked about the Great Depression, we talked about how in the 1920s, the enthusiasm and the belief that the stock market would never go down again, it would go up forever. Well, this same kind of idea was starting to permeate financial markets during this time. But of course, as we know, it doesn't always go up forever. And of course, with these risky banking policies, some very, very, I don't know what the best terminology, bad ideas as far as some financial derivatives and forms that banks began to use to make more profits. Well, they were very risky. And a lot of it dealt with home loans and the ability to give just about anybody as big a home loan as they want, even though they may not have the job or the credit for those. But anyway, so you start seeing home foreclosures, which leads to bankruptcies, which leads to bank failures, and which leads to what would be the Great Recession of 2008, which basically led to almost a new depression and a collapse of the economy. So, on a personal note, I think that those regulations should be reestablished simply because history has shown in the years prior to the deregulation that they worked. Also, technological revolution, the World Wide Web, which changes everything. It's revolutionary in scope. What the internet has done for the ability of the average human being to access knowledge. But it didn't just pop up. It was originally, or the idea of the internet was originally a military application to communicate amongst the military in the United States, and it was called the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or ARPANET. And basically, it was the seed or the idea of how the internet on a larger scale would work. And of course, private corporations took the idea that was established by the government, by the military, and applied it to a free market system and created what we now know as the internet, which most all of us could not live without. It was. I would argue that the internet and the information revolution that occurs from the 1980s up through today is as profound and important as the agricultural revolution that changed the way we live, the industrial revolutions, the printing press, that the invention of the printing press that allowed much broader distribution of books and reading materials. It's going to go down in history as one of the most profound and important revolutions in human history. Also, during this time, you see the rise of partisan politics, which means basically the rise of this division between the two major political parties of the United States, and the beginning of their inability or unwillingness, at least one side or the other at different times, to work together. Prior to the 80s, really, there had always been political disagreements, policy disagreements, but these politicians of the time were all willing to work together and compromise. And that's the important thing about a democratic process and about our process specifically, is it's built on compromise. Our entire country was established on compromise, the great compromise in the Constitution. But you start seeing the end of this, where it becomes much more partisan, and some sides are less willing to compromise or work with the other than others. And some people point to the 1992 Republican National Convention as this kind of the starting point of this, although others might go a little farther back with Ronald Reagan. And during the convention, a man named Patrick Buchanan, who I believe was a speechwriter for President Nixon, and he was a political commentator. He was running for president, and he was running as a Republican during the primaries. He lost, but he was given a platform to speak at the convention, and he went on a rant about culture wars and how we were in the middle of a culture war, and how the traditional quote unquote American culture, which I guess he thought he got to define himself, was under attack, and it's a war, and people, of course, buy into this, and so it began a backlash against what we have always had as a nation, and that's a plural society, multiple peoples, multiple ethnicities, multiple races, multiple religions. This has been that way from the beginning, but it became much more pronounced, especially with the media and the new interconnections with the internet. It becomes much more pronounced and much more embedded in society. And I guess in the past you could really insulate yourself from it if you really wanted to. If you think about our traditional segregated societies back in the 50s and 60s and in the South, well, no longer that. So people are forced to confront their biases and see things and people that they traditionally maybe didn't like but didn't have to deal with. Now they do. Also, during this time, you see an increase in immigration, both legal and illegal, mostly from Latin America and East Asia. And of course, this ties right in with those that call for culture wars, but the backlash against immigration. And of course, anybody that knows American history is, and all America is built on immigration. We're all, unless you are a full-blooded Native American, we are all products of immigration of some sort. Of course, a lot of this new immigration comes from the changing immigration laws, including the Nationalization Act of Immigration Nationalization Act of 1965, which made it easier for Latin American and East Asian immigrants to come in, and also opened the doors for high demand skills, and those people that came over could also bring over their families. And all this together leads to an idea or a concept of multiculturalism. And I guess it could be defined as the tolerance or celebration of diversity in gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. Basically tolerance, basically accepting people that are different from us, at face value, and you don't always necessarily have to agree with their lifestyle, but just the acceptance of it. Others might argue that we should, but I think it's unrealistic to expect all people to celebrate our differences. But the whole idea of multiculturalism is the acceptance of it and the legitimization of it. Of course, the backlash to this is that, especially with regard to sexual orientation, is this, it goes against traditional quote unquote family values. But once again, we have to ask the question, who gets to define what family values are? I mean, we all have different kinds of families, and so the values of those families can vary greatly depending on the type of family. So, but here the idea is that any non-traditional, I guess, family situation was not acceptable. That's kind of the backlash. Also, you have the backlash against Roe v. Wade, which is the Supreme Court case, early 1970s, that made abortion legal in the United States. The Supreme Court, over time, slowly rolled back those protections for people that allow them to get abortions, basically giving states more ability, individually, the states, to limit access to abortion based on trimester, how far along in the pregnancy they are, age, funding. All these things are different ways in which abortions or access to abortions were limited. And then gay rights. Of course, gay people have always historically in this country been, a minority. Traditionally, well, it's one of those things where, as a minority group, many were able to hide their minority status as a gay person, unlike a race. A person of a different race can't hide that, but gay people were traditionally, out of necessity, sometimes forced to hide them to keep their jobs, or to maintain relationships with family and other people. But gay rights had become more and more prevalent during the 1990s, and people calling for a legalization of gay marriage. But in 1998, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed by Congress, which basically stated that states could refuse to recognize gay marriages and civil unions. And this was once again a backlash to this promotion of multiculturalism and specifically gay rights. It was finally, though, overturned in 2015. So it was on the books for a while, but in 2015, gay marriage became legal throughout the United States.